As my grandmother said when she was crowned, coronations are a declaration of our hopes for the future. And I know she's up there, fondly keeping an eye on us, and she'll be a very proud mother.
The palace has reportedly made a decision about Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, and within minutes, the meaning of that decision began to look far bigger than a new royal title or another ceremonial assignment. The name at the center of the announcement was Sophie. The name that made the story explosive was William. According to the reports surrounding the alleged move, the future king backed an expansion of Sophie's royal status at precisely the moment when private succession planning was becoming more sensitive. And that raises one question that refuses to disappear. Why Sophie? The answer, if the reports are accurate, is not sitting in the wording of a public announcement. It is hidden inside what the announcement could allow Sophie to do when the monarchy faces an unexpected transition. The reported change would give her greater responsibility representing the crown, but the deeper claim is even more striking. During an emergency, Sophie could allegedly be placed ahead of several more senior members of the family for specific responsibilities. That would turn an apparently routine royal adjustment into something much more consequential. There is a reason that kind of development would send a shock through royal circles. The British monarchy is built around order. Rank matters, succession matters, protocol matters. Every appearance, every appointment, every duty.
He succeeds me as Duke of Cornwall and takes on the responsibilities for the Duchy of Cornwall, which I have undertaken for more than 5 decades. Today
carries an invisible calculation about who stands where and who speaks for the institution. So when one royal is suddenly given greater operational importance, people naturally begin asking what changed behind closed doors. And if William really supported the decision, the question becomes sharper still. Was he simply supporting Sophie, or was he helping construct the royal team he expects to rely on when his own reign eventually begins? Hi viewers, if you believe Sophie deserves a fair chance to prove what she can do, would you support her new role? Drop a simple yes or no in the comments, because staying silent while decisions are made about the future of the monarchy means letting everyone else decide what that future should look like. And if this is the kind of royal story that deserves to be heard, subscribing, liking, and sharing is the easiest way to make sure it does not disappear beneath the next palace headline. The timing makes the story even more intriguing. The alleged decision does not arrive as an isolated gesture of appreciation. It appears, within the story being told, alongside a much larger concern about continuity. What happens if the monarchy suddenly needs senior representatives who can act without hesitation? What happens if a major transition arrives sooner than expected? And what happens when traditional seniority collides with the practical question of who can actually carry the institution through a crisis? That is where Sophie becomes more interesting than the title itself suggests. Her importance in this account is not built around glamour, rivalry, or a dramatic public confrontation. It is built around usefulness. She is presented as someone who has continued taking on official duties, representing the crown, attending engagements, and operating within the machinery of the royal family without constantly becoming the story herself. In a monarchy that depends heavily on public confidence, that kind of steadiness can become a powerful asset. But the reported elevation carries a strange implication. If Sophie is being prepared for greater responsibility because she is considered dependable, then the decision quietly creates a comparison with everyone else. Who is dependable enough? Who is available enough? Who can handle sensitive duties without turning a crisis into another crisis? Those questions are uncomfortable precisely because they sound practical rather than personal. And then William enters the picture. The alleged support from the Prince of Wales changes the temperature of the entire story. William is not simply another senior royal. He is the heir to the throne and the man who will eventually inherit the institutional problems created by the decisions being made today. If he is backing a broader role for Sophie, it could suggest that he is thinking beyond the next public appearance and toward the architecture of his future monarchy. That possibility matters because succession planning is rarely about one person. It is about what happens when the normal structure is disrupted. A monarch may become unavailable. A senior royal may be unable to travel. A sudden constitutional question may demand immediate representation. A family that looks perfectly organized during a ceremonial event can discover very quickly that its real strength depends on having enough trusted people ready to step forward. The story therefore takes a darker turn. Sophie's reported new status may not be the prize at the end of a competition. It may be a piece being moved into position. The palace could simply be recognizing Sophie's years of service.
Are magnificent. At the heart of the pageantry is a simple message: service. My father's first words on entering Westminster Abbey yesterday were a pledge of service. It was a pledge to continue to serve.
That would be the harmless explanation. It would also be the easiest one, but the reports surrounding this story point towards something more deliberate, something connected to confidential discussions about the future and about which members of the family could be trusted with sensitive responsibilities. William has spent years moving closer to the center of royal responsibility. Sophie has become one of the more visible working members of the family. The monarchy has faced repeated questions about how many active royals it needs and which figures can sustain public duties over time. Put those pieces together, and the alleged decision begins to look less like a sudden reward and more like preparation. But preparation for what? That is the question the palace would have to answer if the reported details ever became official. Because the real shock is not that Sophie could receive more responsibility. That part is easy to imagine. The shock is the possibility that responsibility during a future transition could be distributed according to trust and usefulness rather than simple seniority. Royal observers have long understood the family through a visible ladder, yet a crisis does not always respect that ladder. A person can possess an impressive title and still be unavailable. Another person can occupy a less prominent place and suddenly become indispensable. That is the logic behind the story surrounding Sophie. It also explains why William's alleged involvement matters so much. If the future king is quietly supporting a system that rewards readiness, then he may be signaling the kind of monarchy he wants to inherit. Not necessarily a monarchy built around the loudest personalities.
I am proud to create him Prince of Wales, Tywysog Cymru, the country whose title I've been so greatly privileged to bear during so much of my life and duty.
Or the most senior titles, but one built around people who can be trusted to keep the machinery moving when circumstances become difficult. If Sophie really has been identified as someone who could receive greater emergency responsibility, then somebody else must have been considered less suitable for that role. That does not automatically mean anyone has been removed from the succession. It does not prove that a royal has been punished. It does not establish that a secret constitutional order has already replaced the existing system. But it does create the most uncomfortable question in the entire affair. Who was William thinking about when Sophie was moved forward? That question is where this story stops being about Sophie alone. It becomes a story about trust, preparation, and the possibility of a very different royal hierarchy taking shape before the public has even been told that the rules are changing. And the next part is where the picture becomes even more difficult to dismiss, because the reported palace decision did not appear out of nowhere. Behind it sits a sequence of concerns about the future, the people expected to carry royal duties, and the risks that emerge when a transition happens without warning. Sophie may have been given a new status, but if the reports are accurate, the real decision was about something much bigger. It was about who gets trusted when the crown needs someone to step forward. The first clue was not a dramatic announcement. It was the quiet change in how Sophie was being used. While attention remained fixed on the biggest names in the royal family, Sophie's position was gradually becoming more useful to the institution. Engagement after engagement placed her in situations where the crown needed someone dependable, composed, and willing to keep working without turning every appearance into a personal spectacle. That distinction matters because the story surrounding her alleged elevation is not really about popularity. It is about reliability. And that is precisely what makes the reported decision so unsettling. If the palace simply wanted to recognize Sophie for her service, there would be nothing especially mysterious about it. Senior working royals are regularly given new responsibilities. Roles evolve, patronages change, public duties increase or decrease according to circumstances, but the story being told around Sophie suggests something more deliberate. Her expanded status was allegedly connected to a wider calculation about what happens when the monarchy needs people to act quickly. That changes the question completely. Instead of asking, why is Sophie being rewarded?
Because for over 50 years, in every corner of the UK, across the Commonwealth, and around the world, he has dedicated himself to serve others, both current and future generations, and those whose memory must not be neglected.
The more revealing question becomes, why is Sophie being prepared? The distinction is small on the surface, but enormous underneath. Preparation suggests a future event. It suggests someone inside the institution is looking beyond the next engagement, the next ceremony, and the next headline. It suggests contingency planning. And when the person reportedly supporting that preparation is William, the heir to the throne, the implications become impossible to ignore. William has spent much of his public life being prepared for a role that everyone knows is coming eventually. But becoming king is not simply about inheriting a title. It means inheriting an institution with competing pressures, limited manpower, public expectations, constitutional obligations, and a family whose availability can change overnight. That is why the reported concern about trusted royal representatives becomes so important. A monarchy can have a clear line of succession and still face operational problems. The person next in line may be unavailable. A senior royal may be overseas. Another may be unable to carry out public duties. A sudden transition can create dozens of responsibilities at precisely the moment when the institution has the least room for uncertainty. Sophie, in this account, begins to look like an answer to that problem. Not because she suddenly becomes more senior than everyone around her, but because she could allegedly become more useful in a specific kind of situation. That is a very different form of power. It does not necessarily come with a louder title. It comes with access, trust, responsibility, and the knowledge that when something goes wrong, the palace already knows who can step forward. And this is where Sophie's long relationship with royal service becomes important to the story. She has spent years operating inside the working structure of the monarchy. She has appeared at public engagements, supported charitable causes, represented royal interests, and carried out duties that rarely produce the kind of headlines generated by royal controversy. That can make someone easy to overlook. But inside an institution obsessed with continuity, being overlooked can sometimes be an advantage. A person who does the work quietly can become more valuable than someone who dominates the headlines. That is reportedly where William's calculation enters the picture. If the future king is looking at the royal family through the lens of his eventual reign, he has a very different problem from the one facing a monarch trying to manage the present. Charles has the responsibility of governing the institution as it exists now. William has to think about what happens when that institution becomes his. And that means thinking about people. Who will still be working? Who will still be trusted? Who will be capable of representing the crown without creating another problem? Who will be able to walk into a difficult situation and understand what needs to happen without waiting for instructions? Those questions may sound cold, but succession planning is inherently cold. It cannot be based entirely on affection, family loyalty, or tradition. A serious contingency plan has to account for reality. That is what makes the reported Sophie decision so intriguing. The palace may have looked at a family full of titles and discovered that titles alone do not solve operational problems. The monarchy needs people who can work, and if Sophie was identified as one of those people, her new status could be far more important than it appears. There is another reason William's support matters. William does not have the luxury of pretending that the monarchy will remain exactly as it is. He has already watched the institution change around him. Public expectations have changed. Media scrutiny has intensified. The number of working royals has become a recurring concern. Every senior figure who steps back, becomes unavailable, or reduces public duties increases the pressure on those who remain. A future king looking at that reality would have to ask whether the existing structure is sustainable. That is where the alleged succession shake-up begins to make sense. It may not be about overthrowing anyone. It may not be about removing anyone. It may simply be about deciding who can be relied upon when the old assumptions stop working. But that explanation creates another problem. If Sophie is being elevated because she is considered reliable, then the palace must have had a reason to examine reliability in the first place. Something had to trigger the question. Perhaps it was concern about future workload. Perhaps it was the shrinking pool of working royals. Perhaps it was the possibility of an unexpected transition. Or perhaps, as the more dramatic version of the story suggests, private succession discussions exposed disagreements about which members of the family could actually be trusted with sensitive responsibilities. That last possibility is the one that turns a royal staffing decision into a palace drama. Because trust is not something the monarchy discusses publicly very often. Titles are public, engagements are public, ceremonies are public. Trust is different. Trust exists behind closed doors. It determines who receives information first. It determines who is brought into sensitive discussions. It determines who can be sent somewhere when the stakes are high. And if the reported constitutional briefing really did place unusual emphasis on trust, then Sophie's elevation may have been the visible consequence of a much more private assessment. That would also explain why William's alleged support matters. He would not simply be supporting Sophie as a family member, he would be supporting the principle behind her elevation. A principle that says the future monarchy needs people who can perform under pressure, and suddenly, the apparently modest figure of Sophie becomes much more significant. She represents something William may need desperately when his own reign begins: continuity. There is another subtle detail worth considering. Sophie does not need to compete publicly for attention to become valuable. In fact, her relative distance from the loudest royal controversies could make her more useful. Every controversy creates risk. Every public disagreement creates distraction. Every internal feud becomes a potential headline. But a royal who simply turns up, performs the assignment, speaks to the public, supports the cause, and leaves without creating another crisis, offers something the institution cannot easily manufacture: predictability. And in a crisis, predictability can be worth more than popularity. That may be why the reported decision has attracted so much attention, because Sophie's alleged new status could represent a change in what the palace values. For generations, royal importance has been closely associated with birth order and proximity to the throne. Those things still matter enormously, but a modern monarchy also has to ask a more practical question: who can actually do the job? That question becomes even more significant when the person allegedly pushing the change is William. The future king would eventually inherit every weakness that remains unresolved during the present reign. If there are too few dependable working royals, he inherits that problem. If certain responsibilities are concentrated among too few people, he inherits that problem. If emergency planning is inadequate, he inherits that problem too. So preparing Sophie could be less about the present and more about protecting the future. But there is one detail that makes the entire story more uncomfortable. The reported planning allegedly did not stop at identifying who could help. It also raised the question of who should not be placed in the most sensitive positions. That is where the story takes its next turn. Because once the palace begins ranking people by trust, availability, and usefulness, seniority alone may no longer determine who stands closest to the center of royal power. And according to the claims surrounding this story, that conclusion was already beginning to emerge inside private succession discussions. Sophie may have been moving forward, but the real question was, who was being left behind? The question of who was being left behind became impossible to ignore once William's alleged support for Sophie was placed beside the wider succession picture. This was no longer simply a matter of giving one working royal a larger portfolio. It suggested that someone inside the institution was thinking about the future in a much more calculated way, and William had every reason to think that way. The Prince of Wales is not preparing for a ceremonial promotion. He is preparing to inherit the crown. Every weakness that exists inside the monarchy today could eventually become his problem. Every vacant role, every overworked royal, every public controversy, every breakdown in trust could land on his desk when the responsibility becomes his alone. That makes the reported Sophie decision far more revealing. If William really backed the expansion, then he was not simply looking at where Sophie stands today. He was potentially looking at where she could stand when the pressure becomes much greater. The distinction matters because succession is often described as though it is nothing more than a line of names. One person follows another. One crown passes to another head. The reality is much more complicated. The monarch may be at the center, but the institution surrounding that monarch depends on dozens of decisions being made correctly. Who represents the crown? Who attends the event? Who receives sensitive information? Who speaks when circumstances change suddenly? Who can travel? Who can take over a responsibility without months of preparation? Those questions become especially important when the monarchy faces an unexpected transition. That appears to be the concern at the heart of the story surrounding Sophie. The reported planning was allegedly focused on readiness. Not just who was senior, but who could actually perform a responsibility when circumstances became difficult. That creates a very different measurement of royal importance. Under the traditional system, proximity to the throne carries enormous weight. Birth order matters, titles matter, established precedence matters. But the modern monarchy also has another reality to contend with. Public duties have to be performed by real people, and those people have to be available. That is where Sophie suddenly becomes a much more interesting figure. She has experience, she has visibility, she has spent years carrying out official work. And perhaps most importantly for the story, she has developed a reputation for being able to operate within the institution without constantly becoming embroiled in the controversies surrounding it. If William was looking for people he could rely upon in the future, those qualities would naturally matter. But there is something else. William does not have to wait until he becomes king to begin thinking like a future king. The decisions made while he is Prince of Wales can influence the structure he eventually inherits. The people he works with now can become the people he relies upon later. The relationships developed today can determine how quickly the institution responds when circumstances change. That makes every unusual appointment worth examining. Not because every royal promotion hides a conspiracy, but because the monarchy itself is an institution built around preparation. Preparation for a reign. Preparation for a transition, preparation for uncertainty, and according to the claims surrounding Sophie's reported elevation, that preparation may already be moving beyond the traditional hierarchy. That is where the alleged succession shake-up becomes significant. William may not be trying to change who inherits the throne. The succession to the crown is governed by established constitutional rules. Sophie is not suddenly being placed ahead of heirs to the throne. The reported change is different. It concerns who may be entrusted with responsibilities around the crown when the institution needs additional hands. That distinction is crucial. The story is not that Sophie suddenly becomes the next monarch. It is that her operational importance could increase dramatically. And if that is what William is supporting, it reveals something about how he may view the future. He may believe that the monarchy cannot depend entirely on tradition to decide who carries the workload. It needs people who can deliver. That sounds simple, but inside a royal family, it can become deeply uncomfortable. Because the moment performance becomes part of the calculation, comparisons become unavoidable. One person may have greater seniority, another may have greater experience, another may have a stronger public reputation, another may be more available, and another may simply be considered easier to trust with sensitive responsibilities. There is no guarantee that those categories produce the same names. That is the problem, and it is why a seemingly positive development for Sophie could quietly create anxiety elsewhere. Imagine spending years believing that seniority guarantees a particular level of importance, only to discover that private planning is considering a different measurement. Imagine learning that during an emergency, the person standing beside the future king may not necessarily be the person traditionally expected to stand there. That would change the emotional meaning of the palace announcement. Suddenly, Sophie's new status would no longer look like a reward. It would look like a signal that the institution is preparing for circumstances that the public may not yet understand. And that is where the reported confidential constitutional briefing becomes central. According to the story surrounding the alleged briefing, the concern was not simply how many working royals were available. It was who could be trusted with sensitive duties if the monarchy suddenly entered a period of transition. That word, trusted, carries enormous weight. Trust implies an assessment. An assessment implies comparison. And comparison implies that not everyone received the same answer. The palace has never publicly presented such a calculation in the dramatic terms surrounding this story. There is no confirmed public document establishing that Sophie has formally been placed above named senior royals for emergency constitutional duties. Those claims remain part of the reported narrative. But the possibility is exactly what gives the story its tension, because if William is genuinely trying to build a stronger team around the future crown, then he has to decide what strength actually means. It may mean loyalty, it may mean discretion, it may mean experience, it may mean public credibility, it may mean the ability to take instructions and act without creating unnecessary drama. And Sophie fits several of those categories remarkably well. That could explain why her role has become so intriguing. She does not need to be the most powerful royal in the room. She only needs to be the person the institution knows it can call when something goes wrong. That is a quieter form of influence, and sometimes the quietest influence is the hardest to see until it has already taken shape. For William, that could be exactly the point. A future monarchy cannot be built overnight. It has to be assembled piece by piece while the current structure is still operating. The people who will carry that future have to be identified before they are urgently needed. The roles have to be tested, the responsibilities have to be distributed, and the institution has to discover who can withstand the pressure. That makes Sophie's alleged elevation potentially part of a much larger experiment. Can the monarchy become leaner without becoming weaker? Can fewer working royals carry more responsibility? Can people outside the traditional inner circle become essential to the crown? And can William build a structure that functions even when the unexpected happens? Those are not questions about palace gossip alone. They are questions about survival, because the monarchy has already learned that public confidence can change quickly. A royal family can appear stable one month and face intense scrutiny the next. A single controversy can consume weeks of attention. A sudden absence can force duties onto people who were never expected to carry them. William has watched that process from close range. He knows that preparation cannot begin after a crisis starts. It has to begin before. That makes his reported support for Sophie one of the most revealing details in the entire story. It suggests that he may be thinking about people not only according to where they stand in the family, but according to what they can contribute to the institution he will one day lead. And that is where the audience is forced to reconsider the entire announcement. Sophie is not necessarily moving closer to the throne. She may be moving closer to the machinery that protects the throne. That is a very different kind of power. And if that machinery is being redesigned, then somebody will inevitably find that their old position no longer guarantees the influence they once expected. That is the part of the story that makes the alleged succession shake-up so uncomfortable. Because William does not need to publicly confront anyone to change the balance. He only needs to decide who he trusts. One appointment can shift expectations. One expanded responsibility can create a new precedent. One private recommendation can change who receives the call when the institution enters a difficult moment. And if Sophie has genuinely been selected for that kind of role, then her elevation may be less about what she has been given and more about what William believes she can become. Hi viewers! If you think the future of the monarchy should be built around people who actually show up and do the work, rather than simply relying on titles, then leave a simple yes in the comments. And if you believe this shift deserves to be seen rather than ignored, a like and a share helps push the story beyond the usual royal headlines. Subscribe as well, because the next part of this story goes directly into the private succession question that could explain why Sophie was moved forward in the first place. Because there is still one problem. If Sophie was being prepared for greater responsibility, what exactly was the palace preparing her for? The answer may lie inside the confidential briefing, and once that question is opened, the story stops being about Sophie's new status. It becomes a question of who the future crown believes it can trust when everything changes. The confidential briefing is where the Sophie story reportedly takes its most uncomfortable turn. Behind the polished photographs, the formal titles, and the carefully arranged royal appearances was a much colder question. If the monarchy suddenly needed someone to act, who would actually be trusted to do it? That question changes everything, because once trust becomes the measurement, seniority is no longer the only thing that matters. A royal can have an impressive position and still be unavailable. Another can have years of experience but be unsuitable for a sensitive assignment. Someone else can be less prominent but more dependable when the pressure rises. And according to the claims surrounding this story, Sophie's name began appearing in precisely that conversation. The alleged briefing was not about changing the line of succession to the throne. Sophie was not suddenly being placed ahead of the direct heirs. The issue was reportedly much more specific. Who could be given important responsibilities surrounding the crown if a sudden transition or emergency made the normal arrangement impossible to maintain? That distinction is critical. It means the reported shakeup was not necessarily an attempt to rewrite centuries of constitutional tradition. It was potentially an attempt to rewrite the way the institution functions around that tradition. And that is where William's alleged support becomes much harder to dismiss. If the future king backed Sophie because he considered her reliable, then he was effectively endorsing a new way of measuring royal usefulness, not simply by birth, not simply by title, not simply by where someone appears in a procession, but by whether that person can be trusted when the institution is under pressure. The implications would be enormous. For years, royal hierarchy has been visible to the public. People know who stands where. They know who is closer to the throne. They know which members carry senior titles. But the public rarely sees the second hierarchy operating behind the official one. That hierarchy is built around access. Who gets called first? Who is brought into sensitive discussions? Who is trusted to represent the family when tensions are high? Who can be given responsibility without creating another problem? Those questions are rarely answered in public. Yet they can determine how a monarchy actually functions. According to the story surrounding Sophie's alleged elevation, the confidential discussions exposed a growing need for exactly that kind of planning. The concern was not necessarily that the existing system had failed. It was that the existing system might not be strong enough if circumstances change suddenly. That is a very different fear. A palace can prepare for a scheduled succession. It can prepare for a coronation. It can prepare for anniversaries, state occasions, overseas tours, and ceremonial transitions. What it cannot schedule is an emergency. And emergencies have a way of exposing weaknesses that remain invisible during normal times. That is why the alleged briefing matters. It reportedly forced attention onto the people who would have to keep the institution functioning if several expected duties suddenly became impossible. The answer could not simply be, choose whoever is next in line. The people being considered would need to be available, experienced, discreet, capable of representing the crown, and able to operate without turning sensitive situations into public spectacles. That description brings Sophie directly back into the center of the story. Her value, according to the narrative surrounding the alleged decision, was precisely that she could perform the work. She had experience representing the royal family. She had spent years carrying official responsibilities. She understood the rhythm of royal engagements. She could stand in front of cameras without making herself the center of every story. And in an institution increasingly conscious of public confidence, that matters. But then came the more uncomfortable part. If Sophie was considered especially suitable, then the same assessment had to be applied to everyone else. That is where the reported briefing becomes potentially explosive. A confidential discussion about trust does not simply identify the people who are trusted. It also identifies the people who may not be trusted in the same way. No public document has established that named senior royals were formally stripped of emergency responsibilities. No confirmed palace statement has publicly declared that Sophie outranks specific family members in a new constitutional hierarchy. Those details remain part of the claims surrounding the story. But the possibility alone explains why the alleged decision could create tension. Imagine a royal family operating according to a familiar hierarchy, only to discover that behind closed doors there is another calculation taking place. A calculation based on reliability, a calculation based on public confidence, a calculation based on who can actually carry responsibility when the situation becomes difficult. That would quietly change the meaning of seniority. It would mean that someone could remain highly senior on paper while becoming less central to the practical operation of the institution, and someone else could gain influence without receiving the kind of dramatic title that normally announces a rise in power. That is exactly why Sophie's alleged elevation is so intriguing. Her new status could be less about making her look important and more about making her useful. There is also a deeper strategic reason William could support such a structure. When William eventually becomes king, he will inherit the consequences of decisions being made now. If the monarchy does not have enough dependable working royals, he will face that shortage. If too much responsibility rests on too few people, he will inherit the burden. If a crisis exposes gaps in the royal structure, he will be the person expected to solve them. Preparing a wider circle of trusted representatives before that moment would therefore make sense from a long-term perspective. It would also explain why Sophie could become important without challenging the direct succession. Her role would not be to replace the heir. Her role would be to strengthen the institution surrounding the heir. That is a subtle distinction, but it could be the most important detail in the entire story. And then, another question emerges. Why now? Why would these concerns suddenly become urgent enough for Sophie to receive an expanded status? The answer is not publicly established by the claims surrounding this story. There is no confirmed evidence presented here proving that a specific emergency is imminent or that a secret transition has already been scheduled. But the reported planning suggests that the palace may simply be preparing for uncertainty. That alone would be enough to justify a broader conversation about the future. The monarchy cannot assume that every senior royal will always be available. It cannot assume that public opinion will remain stable. It cannot assume that the next transition will unfold exactly according to expectations. So the institution has to build resilience before it needs it. And Sophie, in this narrative, becomes part of that resilience. That makes her alleged new status more significant than it first appeared. The public sees a royal receiving greater responsibility. Inside the story, however, the move represents something else. A test, a signal, a preparation for a future in which William may want the people closest to the crown chosen according to a different standard, not simply who is senior, but who is ready. And if that standard is really being applied, then the most important names may not be the ones appearing in the headlines. They may be the ones being quietly excluded from the most sensitive discussions. That possibility is what turns Sophie's promotion into a potential power shift, because the palace does not need to publicly remove someone to reduce their influence. It only needs to stop relying on them. The difference can be almost invisible at first. One person receives an important assignment. Another is not invited. One royal is consulted. Another hears about the decision afterward. One name appears repeatedly in contingency planning. Another slowly disappears from the conversation. No announcement is necessary. No confrontation is required. The balance simply changes, and according to the story surrounding Sophie, that may be exactly what has begun happening. The most startling part, however, is what this could reveal about William himself. If he really backed the move, then he may already be thinking beyond the monarchy he is preparing to inherit. He may be thinking about how to make that monarchy survive pressure, uncertainty, and the unpredictable demands of modern public life. Sophie could therefore be more than the recipient of a new status. She could be evidence of William's preferred model for the future. A model in which trust carries as much weight as tradition. A model in which responsibility follows capability. And a model in which the quietest royals can become the most important when the institution needs them most. But that raises the question that the alleged briefing could not avoid. If Sophie was considered trustworthy enough to move forward, which members of the royal family were considered less dependable? That is the detail that could transform this from a story about one woman's new role into a story about an entire family being quietly rearranged. And the answer may explain why William's support matters far more than Sophie's title. Because the real power in a succession shake-up is not always given to the person who moves forward. Sometimes it is revealed by the person who suddenly stops being considered indispensable. The most important question now is not whether Sophie has received a more prominent role. It is what that role could mean when the monarchy enters its next uncertain chapter. If the reports surrounding this decision are accurate, William has effectively backed a different way of organizing royal responsibility. Sophie's expanded status would not change the constitutional line of succession, but it could change something almost as important inside the institution: who is considered ready to carry the crown's responsibilities when circumstances suddenly become difficult. That is why the palace announcement matters. It would be easy to look at Sophie's elevation as another adjustment to the working royal family and move on. But the details surrounding the reported decision point toward a deeper calculation. The monarchy needs people who can represent it. It needs people who can travel, appear publicly, handle sensitive assignments, and continue working when attention is intense. And Sophie has increasingly fit that description. Her strength in this story is not that she has suddenly become more powerful than everyone else. It is that she may have become more useful than many people realized. That is a very different kind of royal influence. It does not always appear in photographs. It does not always generate headlines. It can exist quietly in the decisions about who receives responsibility when the institution is under pressure. And if William really is supporting that model, then Sophie could be one of the clearest signs yet of how the future monarchy may operate. The traditional hierarchy would remain. The crown would remain. The constitutional order would remain. But around those structures, the practical machinery could begin to look different. That is where the alleged succession shake-up becomes so significant. It is not necessarily about removing people. It is about choosing who can be relied upon. And those two things can produce the same result. A royal can remain highly senior while becoming less central to the day-to-day operation of the institution. Another royal can remain several places away from the throne while becoming increasingly important because the future king trusts that person to deliver. That is the potential transformation hidden inside Sophie's reported new status. The monarchy could be moving toward a system where usefulness matters more than appearances, where reliability matters more than ceremony, where experience matters more than expectations, and where the people standing closest to the future king are not necessarily the people everyone assumed would be there. William's alleged support becomes the final piece of that puzzle. He is the person who eventually has to live with the structure being created now. He will inherit the crown, but he will also inherit its vulnerabilities. He will inherit the demands of a public that expects more transparency. He will inherit an institution that has to justify its relevance constantly. He will inherit the responsibility of maintaining continuity when circumstances refuse to follow the plan. So preparing dependable people around that future would be logical, and Sophie may now represent exactly that kind of preparation. But there is another side to this. The more responsibility Sophie receives, the more closely every decision involving her will be watched. Her appearances will carry greater significance. Her assignments will be examined more carefully. Her proximity to senior royals will attract more attention. And if she begins appearing in circumstances where another senior royal might traditionally have been expected, the speculation will only intensify. That is when the alleged palace strategy would become visible to the public, not through one dramatic announcement, through repetition, one responsibility, then another, until a new pattern becomes impossible to miss. That is how institutional change often happens. Not with a single explosion, but through a series of small decisions that eventually create a completely different picture. And that may be the most important lesson from this entire story. The monarchy does not necessarily need to announce that the old system is ending. It can simply begin operating differently. If Sophie is repeatedly trusted with sensitive responsibilities, if William continues supporting her expanded role, and if other senior figures gradually become less central to those same responsibilities, the public will eventually see the difference for itself. That would be a succession shakeup without a dramatic succession announcement, and it would explain why the alleged constitutional briefing is so important. The briefing, as described in the story, was supposedly not about emotion. It was about preparedness. Who can be trusted? Who can act? Who can represent the crown? Who can keep sensitive matters confidential? Who can step forward if the expected person cannot? Those questions sound ordinary until they determine who sits closest to the center of power. Then, they become everything. And Sophie's reported elevation begins to look like the answer to one of those questions. She may not be the most obvious royal choice. She may not be the person most people would expect to see at the center of a succession strategy. But that could be exactly why her rise is so revealing. The future monarchy may not be built around obvious choices. It may be built around dependable ones. That would also explain why William's alleged backing matters more than the announcement itself. The palace can issue a statement. The public can react to a title. The media can debate the meaning. But William's support would reveal the strategic thinking underneath it. It would suggest that the future king is already considering which people he wants around him when the responsibility becomes his. And that takes the story beyond Sophie. It becomes a story about William, about the kind of monarchy he may want, and about the standards he may use when deciding who gets trusted with its most sensitive responsibilities. The most striking possibility is that this is not a rebellion against the old system at all. It is an adaptation of it. William would not need to abolish tradition. He would only need to make sure the people operating within that tradition are capable of meeting the demands of a very different era. That is why Sophie's alleged new status could become so important. She represents the possibility that the future crown will reward those who can quietly carry its weight. Not those who demand attention, not those who depend entirely on seniority, but those who can step into a difficult moment and keep the institution moving. And that brings the story back to the question that has been hanging over everything from the beginning. Why Sophie? The answer may be simpler and more consequential than anyone expected. Because when William looked toward the future, he may have been looking for someone he could trust, someone experienced, someone steady, someone who could carry responsibility without needing to be at the center of every headline, someone who could help protect the institution when the circumstances became unpredictable. That does not mean every claim surrounding this story is confirmed. The reported constitutional briefing and the alleged emergency hierarchy remain part of the story being circulated, not established public constitutional fact. But the underlying question remains powerful. What happens when a future king starts judging royal importance by performance rather than expectation? The answer is a monarchy that begins to change before the public realizes it has changed. Sophie's reported elevation could therefore be the beginning of a much larger transformation. Not a new throne, not a new succession line, but a new understanding of who matters when the crown needs support. And if William truly backs that approach, then the palace may have just revealed something about his future reign without saying it directly. He intends to be prepared. He intends to have people around him who can be trusted, and he may be willing to look beyond the traditional assumptions about who should carry the responsibility. That leaves one final question. If Sophie has now been positioned for a more important role during a future transition, who else has quietly lost ground? Because that is the part of the story the palace cannot easily explain away. A promotion for one royal can be celebrated. A restructuring of the people trusted with the crown is something else entirely. The next time Sophie steps forward in an official capacity, the public may look at that appearance differently. Not simply as another engagement, not simply as another royal photograph, but as another piece of evidence in a much larger pattern. A pattern that began with a new status. A pattern that reportedly gained William's support. A pattern that allegedly emerged from private succession planning. And a pattern that could ultimately determine who stands closest to the future crown when the moment of transition finally arrives. Hi viewers, if this story has made one thing clear, it is that the future of the monarchy may be decided long before the next crown is physically placed on anyone's head. If you want to keep following these developments, subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this video with someone who follows the royal family closely. Because if Sophie's reported elevation really is part of a larger plan, the next decision could reveal far more than the palace intended the public to see. For now, Sophie has the new status. William has reportedly backed the direction, and the question of who can truly be trusted with the future of the crown remains unanswered. That may be the real story. Not who is being crowned, not who is being removed, but who is quietly being prepared.